Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome in. We are continuing, I guess not through Revelation, but we finished a long, extensive series on Revelation.
Yeah, it took us like 3 months.
Just 3 months, 3.5 years or so. But we've done that. We've gone through the book, and now we're just going to continue having a series of special guests on. And so this is cool, Rob. You and we've done the podcast together for I think June or July is celebrating 3 years now of me being on with you. And we're at the point where we start getting repeated guests on there. Yeah. And so now we get to welcome back Dr. Warren Carter today.
Yeah, absolutely. So Warren, thank you for being with us. Warren is a New Testament scholar specializing in the gospel and empire, born in New Zealand and now living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Dr. Carter has a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, a BD THM from Melbourne College of Divinity in Australia. He's an ordained New Zealand Baptist minister with membership in the Disciples of Christ. Warren is currently the LaDonna Kramer Menders Professor of New Testament at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa. Before coming to Phillips, and Dr. Carter was on the faculty of Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas, where 4 times he received the Louise Clark Britton Endowed Faculty Excellence Award. His writings, which have been very influential for me, include The Roman Empire and the New Testament, an essential guide, John and Empire, Matthew and Empire. He wrote a commentary on the Gospel of Mark as well. But we're here today to talk about the book of Revelation. So he's written a really good, handy, almost introductory level commentary that's 130 pages or so called What Does Revelation Reveal? So we're here to talk about that. So thanks, Warren, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Again, I want to thank you so much for your work on empire and the scriptures. It's been so formative for me to really understand what's going on and wrapping the biblical story in this larger picture of empire. It's been so revolutionary for me. Now, Warren, I've argued here in the book of Revelation, Vinnie and I did a couple episodes on the book of Revelation, and I argue that the book of Revelation reveals a number of things for John's readers, including the fact that God is the one in power, not Caesar. God's the one on the throne, not Caesar. And that God manifests his power through love, through the Lamb, and that we as the people of God are called to follow Christ in this way of sacrificially dying for the sake of the other, while Caesar and empire manifests itself through power and violence in war. With framing with that there, let's start with, what do you think is the big picture message of the book of Revelation and to the churches?
Yeah, I think we have to take the title of the writing seriously, that it is a revelation. Yeah. This Greek word could be translated, it's a manifestation, it's a disclosing, it's a taking out of hiding, which would be literally the Greek word. So I think the question is, what does it reveal? What does it make known? What does it manifest? And my argument is that fundamental to it is this big concern with how Jesus' followers are to live in relation to their contemporary society, which, of course, in the time of Revelation was the Roman Empire, how to negotiate life in the Roman Empire. And I think that's the huge contribution that Revelation makes in framing this question so clearly for Jesus folks. How to engage the big wide world, in this case, the powers of empire. But I think the limitation of Revelation is its response, its answer, which I don't find particularly helpful or beneficial. Now, that's not to say that there aren't a whole bunch of really good things along the way. But in terms of the final answer, which comes in chapter 18, when the writer calls the Jesus folks to come out from the empire, which is a response of retreat, of running away, of disengagement. I really don't think that's a very helpful response. Of course, the book itself has this perspective, this answer that's framed in terms of an analysis of the Roman Empire. So it's not just off the top of his head, here's a thought to entertain for the day. Much of Revelation is a sustained analysis of the Roman Empire. namely that it marked by idolatry.
Mm-hmm.
It's marked by false worship. It's already under divine judgment. And in fact, it's in the power of the devil. The devil is the power behind this whole imperial system. And its judgment, its final destruction is imminent. And the point of all of that good news, the point of all of that is, why would you want to have anything to do with this imperial system? So the logic, get out, retreat from the empire. So I think the first 3 chapters of Revelation basically make this point to the 7 churches in Asia, province of Turkey, province of the empire, which we know as Turkey today.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, the book could end at the end of chapter 3.
Right.
It's made this point to the 7 letters, and apparently the 6 churches get to read everybody else's, 7 churches get to read everybody else's mail.
Yeah.
But the point is made by the end of chapter 3. And so chapters 4 through 22 kind of are so important for laying out the theological thinking, the theological foundation for this call to disengage. We get the vision of true worship in the heavens, not idolatry, but true worship. And in chapters 6, 7, and 8, we get this analysis that already the world is under divine judgment. This is the 4 horses of the apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because God is sitting in heaven somewhere zapping down thunderbolt, but rather God is leaving the world, the imperial world, to the consequences of its own misuse of power, its misuse of violence, which are very destructive, and so forth through the rest of the document. Is the sort of the foundation, what's supporting this call for disengagement to come out from the empire.
I'm curious, you say you don't believe, if I'm understanding right, that John goes far enough in pushing. He obviously says, come out for my people, but how would you, I don't, it's hard to say how would you have written it, but what do you maybe wish you would have seen, or what do you feel is lacking? I don't know if that's the best way to ask the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, because I think the document basically poses 2 diametrically opposed stances towards the empire. Mm-hmm. And I think this comes to the fore in the sharpest way and the nastiest way in the letter in chapter 2 to the church in Thyatira.
Mm-hmm.
So the writer's perspective is distance, engagement, no participation, come out, run away. Tons of passion, but not a lot of program. So clearly no idolatry, no food offered to idols, but it seems more than that. Disengage, come out, run away. So that's one perspective on the question, how are Jesus folks to make their way in this imperial world? Run away. But in chapter 2, with the letter to the church in Thyatira, he gets really nasty with the leader of the church in Thyatira. He gives her what I think is a nickname by calling her Jezebel. I don't think that's her real name.
Sure.
I think that's his nickname, and we know how politicians like to nickname opponents with nasty nicknames. So he calls her Jezebel, this queen of Israel, who along with Ahab advocated for idolatry and misled the folks out of covenant relationship and all that stuff. And he really gets stuck into her because she seems to have a very different approach, that it's okay to be part of the empire. It's okay for Jesus folks to participate in imperial systems. This doesn't necessarily mean a betrayal. One can be faithful in doing that and that participation. He clearly disagrees, and of course she, whoever she is, doesn't ever get the right of response. But participation is a very pragmatic approach. Where are these folks going to go if they get out of the empire? How are they going to live? How are they going to sustain themselves? They need work, they need a place to live. And I think it's a very pragmatic approach to the issue, that you can be part of this imperial system without being sucked into it, without being misled by it. So I think those are the 2 options that Revelation offers. But I think there's a third option. And I don't think it was necessarily available to these folks in the first century. Your question, Vinnie, if I was writing this, I think in the first century, I probably wouldn't imagine another option. But I think in our own time, there is an option. And that is to be part of a world that in our case is very much a world of empire, and we can name that empire in various different ways, whether we name it in nationalistic ways or economic ways, a system of capitalism, for example, which works very well for some people, but not for a lot of other people, whether we name it in terms of multinationals, as some have done, however we name it in our own time. We do have an option other than running away or simply existing. We do have means of exercising some sort of transformative power in the midst of living with different commitments, with different practices, and in ways that we do know in a democracy that sometimes people do have people power and can exercise it in ways to affect transformations, whether at a local level or a larger level. Now, I don't think that folks, especially poor folks living in a town like Ephesus or Thyatira or Philadelphia in the first century had that option. They really didn't have much of an option for those sorts of societal transformations. I think they did have the option amongst themselves of living a sort of an alternative way of life with some different commitments and values and practices, obviously. But I don't think they had much impact beyond themselves on the larger society.
How much of that would you say is a contextualization for the application of Revelation? Because what I'm hearing is, if we're talking to the church in America, we have so many more options for how we would apply this and how far we're actually able to push, where even today, if we were to preach the message of Revelation to our brothers and sisters like in China or North Korea, where they don't have these options, would you say that they might be more closely paralleled to first century Roman Christians, just because they also don't have those options that we might have in the West?
Yeah, I think so. I think what's happening with the leadership of the woman in Thyatira, where survival is clearly the name of the game. That's the dominant name of the game, to be faithful to Jesus in the midst. And so I think being faithful in that way would be very contextualized for certain folks in our own time. But in the West, we do have some option in getting ourselves educated and motivated to use those. And I don't just mean about petty little issues. I mean about matters of societal vision. And again, that's where I think Revelation offers a real gift. Whether we agree with this analysis of the empire being in the hands of the devil and the empire already collapsing because this is part of divine judgment, whether we agree with that analysis or not, it presses the question of what sort of world do we want? What sort of structures? Who benefits? Who gets hurt? Who's favored? Who's excluded? All those questions come to the fore. And I think Revelation presses that with its analysis of the misuse of power. And that's a fundamental piece of it. The imperial system is a devilish system because of what it does to people. It's misuse of power. And I think the force of that analysis is a really important gift, whether we buy the particulars in the way of wording it or not.
I want to make sure I'm clear. It almost sounds, and tell me and correct me if I'm wrong, please, that you're thinking that maybe Jezebel, nickname is fine, wasn't as bad as John's portraying her, or that she's not as wrong as John says she is. You see what I'm trying to say? Oh, okay. Help me understand where you land with that.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Okay.
He wants to claim that she's this wicked Jezebel-like figure, that any participation in the empire is a participation in idolatry and all the rest of it. There are various ways of negotiating idolatry in the ancient world. You can't escape it. It's everywhere. But if you're a trades worker, for example, say you're a woodworker, and your particular trade meets every 2 weeks, 4 weeks, or whatever at some location, you have a meal because you have a patron, you have a sponsor, and you basically network. This is what you do. And as part of this gathering, there could well be, most likely, an image of the emperor, and a small offering is made to that image in the gathering, and then we get along with the rest of the proceedings. If you're a Christian woodworker, what do you do? I wish we knew. So all we've got are some guesses. You could go late and avoid that little part of the gathering. When that gathering takes place, you could go outside for a smoke. Or
at some point, that's going to become obvious, though, right? At some point, you can only be late for so many months in a row.
So many times.
So
you could stand there while this little honoring takes place, muttering to yourself, Jesus is Lord.
Right, yeah, okay, right.
I don't believe this for half a second. This is just nonsense. Whatever your self-talk, in the way that you distance yourself from what's going on. This isn't compulsory, this observance of imperial figures, but it's encouraged and everybody does it. But there are ways of doing that. And we actually have some texts from the 3rd or 4th century, and I'm forgetting the exact details, a commentary on some discussion of 1 Peter, where we do have this practice taking place of folks who are present but not buying into what is happening. Plenty of folks who go to baseball games and the mandatory national anthem.
Correct.
I was actually just thinking about that example.
Yeah.
That's my conviction, where I'll stand up to be respectful, but I'm not participating in singing the Star Spangled Banner. I'm praying actually during those times.
Exactly. This honoring from which some folks want to dissent. And there are various ways of dissenting. If you sit down, you might be praying, God help me. That could be particularly provocative in some contexts. But there are ways of dissenting. So I think that's the sort of thing that may well be happening with Jezebel in the church in Thyatira. He, of course, says that's idolatry, any participation. If you haven't come out from the empire, then you're participating. But what are they supposed to do? Where are they supposed to go? What are the pragmatics of this come out from her? Again, plenty of passion, but not much of a program.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Just to make sure we're clear on, you made a comment that for John, the imperial world is in the control of the devil, and you alluded to that earlier. Here, you comment on page 91 in your book, there's no escape from these consequences, no rapture or free ticket out. There's no encouragement to launch a violent attack on empire. Instead, there's only absorption of the faithful resistance to its demands because of loyalty to Jesus. You see the beast as empire being empowered by the dragon. What do you think is the false prophet then, and what do you do with the number 666? How do you understand those in terms of Revelation?
Okay. So we're in chapter 13 in Revelation, which in my analysis is part of a subunit of chapters 12, 13, and 14.
I agree.
And part of 12, 13, and 14, the big point is that the devil is very active on planet Earth. So the devil has been thrown out of heaven in chapter 12, and so heaven is now a devil-free, evil-free realm under the rule of God. But the devil is having the devil's patty tantrum now on the earth. And so we have this description of the wrath of the devil that is being exhibited here. And we have this strange passage about the devil chasing this unidentified woman. And of course, interpreters for a long time have made all sorts of guesses who this figure is. Or in my thinking, I think it's a composite figure. I think there are parts Eve, there's parts Israel, there's parts Mary, there's parts the church. I think it's a very composite figure. And the fundamental characteristic of the devil's activity at the end of 12 is to go after the woman's children, who are those who hold the commands of, who obey or hold the commands of God and the teaching of Jesus. So it's clear who the targets are. So that then takes us into chapter 13. And I think what chapter 13 does is identify two agents of the devil, the dragon.
Right.
And these are the two beasts.
Hey everyone, we want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast. And we want to remind you that everything we provide at Determined Truth is free of charge. And this even includes all of the teaching that Rob does on a weekly basis to pastors in India and around the world. We don't have any supporters that get special behind the scenes access. But we can only do this with the generous support that comes from those of you who can afford to give.
So if you would prayerfully consider supporting us with anything from $5 a month or more, we will continue to work hard to challenge the church to be the church. To give, go to determinedtruth.com and click on the Give tab, or follow the link in the show notes.
I think the first one represents the empire as a whole, and particularly personified in the figure of the emperor. And I agree with those who think that this wounded figure echoes Nero's suicide. Some folks have tried to use that to date Revelation.
Right.
That this comes right after Nero's suicide in the year 68.
Right.
I think that's possible. Other folks have wanted to date it into the 80s or the 90s,
right,
but use Nero as the archetypal.
Yeah, the template.
Yeah, the most baddest of all. You can't get worse.
There you go.
Than
you're from New Zealand, so you speak English a little differently than we do.
Exactly.
Is that what that is? Okay.
Comparatives and superlatives. And so, with some distance, Nero is a safe figure to attack because he's dead. So I think that's the first beast represents the empire, and particularly personified in the emperor. So that brings us to the second beast, and to your question about the prophet, the false prophet. It's pretty clear in those verses that the role of this second beast, this false prophet so-called, is to inspire worship of the first beast. We've got this stuff about signs and miracles that point to the first beast. We've got the stuff about encouraging people to make images of the first beast. So we're into idolatry, which of course never goes away in Revelation, and sets about attacking and even killing those who don't cooperate in this honoring of the first beast, and also sets about putting this identifying mark on the foreheads of those of all citizens, all inhabitants, without it which you can't buy or sell. Right. So this is why I think the term the false prophet is used, because the second beast bears witness to, points to, promotes allegiance to the first beast, the emperor and the empire.
He's called the false prophet in chapter 16. And do you identify that label there with the second beast here in chapter 13?
Yeah, I'm taking that false prophet as the second beast. So bearing witness to the emperor. And I identify that, and some others have suggested that as well, with folks who are leaders in cities around the empire. Sometimes governors, but often local folks, local elites. And there's plenty of documentation that in these local cities, you can think of Ephesus, Pergamon, Thyatira, you can think of Antioch, Jerusalem, that these local leaders compete with each other for prominence in the cities and seek favor with a local governor, a Rome-appointed governor, or with Rome itself. So who can be more patriotic than somebody else? That takes the form of funding games, for example.
Right.
And as part of the games, you're going to honor the emperor in some way, building temples, building statues, paying for statues of the emperor, having celebrations, big meals, for example. So you spend your wealth in a conspicuous way to make sure everybody notices your loyalty to the emperor, the empire, in the hopes that there will be rewards.
Right.
You'll be noticed, and you personally might gain from it, and or your town or your city might gain from it as well. So I think that's the role of the second beast, this false prophet, in terms of encouraging that sort of interest. I don't think the mark of 666 is a literal deal. I don't think there was any campaign where everybody had to line up and get stamped. But I think it's a symbolic way of indicating that what we're talking about here is not just a religious practice. And that's one of the things that I think readers of Revelation have to really get sorted out, that idolatry is not just a religious matter, or this loyalty in terms of worship is not just a religious matter. This is very much a whole package deal.
Yeah.
political, economic,
Yeah,
cultural, religious,
exactly.
social, the whole shooting box.
Yeah.
And you don't get one without the other. I know that we have this myth in our society of religion as separated from politics, but of course it is a great big myth. And there are lots of examples that we
Yeah.
could think of where politics and religion do mix.
We have politics and sports already talking about the Star Spangled Banner at the beginning of a baseball game.
We have it there in that cultural
Yeah,
practice.
that's the national religion right there.
Yeah, just to be a little controversial, if a president waves a Bible around or promotes a Bible to be bought,
Yeah.
this is a political religious act. It's not just a religious matter. It's a very political act, and it's a very economic act because it's a fundraising exercise as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So this is not foreign to us. We know something about this, whether we recognize it or not, and whether we name it or not. It's part of the mix, just as it was in the ancient world.
I'm curious, Warren, to go on your thesis that the first century world isn't taking it far enough because of their context. If you were to teach, you're preaching to a congregation or you're writing from a popular standpoint, and you're first laying out what 666, how that would have been understood, taking the mark of the beast in the first century culture, how would you then push in our Western context? Hey, now Westerners, this is what it means for us to not take the mark of the beast.
Yeah, I think we're back to my third option.
Okay.
Of seeking ways to be, do we swallow the gospel of capitalism hook, line, and sinker? Or are we willing to recognize that, yeah, it's a pretty good system for some folks,
right,
but not for other folks? The folks who work 2 jobs, the folks who work 3 jobs, the folks just absolutely desperate. I know in the area where I live, there are certain days in which certain churches hold food distribution events, and they do it weekly. Not once in a blue moon, not once at Christmas, weekly, because of the economic challenges of the area. This takes place in the so-called richest, most powerful democracy or empire that the world has ever seen, where we can't even feed one another. What do they say? Food insecure figures of 20-25% of the population.
Yeah, 25% or more of the kids go to sleep at night on an empty stomach. Yeah.
Yeah, and then supposedly go to school adequately fed as well. This is horrendous in our society. I think we can't even feed one another. That's so basic, and let alone house one another.
Right.
So these are sorts of things that I think places where intervention and transformation are possible.
If I'm hearing this, and I'm trying to think of in the mindset of maybe many of the congregates in my local congregation, and we're trained to work in antithetical paradigms, where they just heard Warren say that critique capitalism in a sense, therefore he's saying socialism is the answer. But then
communism,
we're communism. But that's a world system as well.
Right.
And I don't think that's what you're saying is we just need to do the opposite.
What I'm saying is that gospel is a system.
Okay. Expand on that a little more. Go with that.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
I think your point, Vinnie, is right. We've been trained to think in certain ways. We've been trained to think in dualisms. We've also been trained to think in spiritualizations.
Yes.
That the dominant hermeneutic in most churches is one of spiritualization.
Yeah. Explain what you mean by that, because I think Vinnie and I are tracking with you, but
that's
sure
great.
Everyone else
I love
understands.
this.
Yeah. We're trained to think about me and Jesus. And we're trained to think about me and my soul and how I live my little life, and whether I use a naughty word or not, or whether I get, I was going to say, but I can't say that, whether I get annoyed with somebody or not. And it's that micro stuff.
It's just personal piety.
Very personal piety.
And the goal to get to heaven someday when I die, when it's all said and done.
Yeah, as long as I'm a good boy and all that sort of stuff. It's very interior. It's very much an internal spiritualization of these things.
Individualization as well, would you say?
And individualization, absolutely. Okay. But what I think, if we're going to talk about empire as a reality, then we're talking about a societal structure. We're talking about a societal vision. We're talking about societal practices. And I think the gospel is much, much bigger than whether I use a naughty word today or not. I think if we think about the life of Jesus, it's about feeding people. It's about a way of justice for people. And I think Revelation, by getting so worked up about the imperial system, puts those sorts of questions on the agenda. What sort of world do we want? What sort of world works out the divine purposes, the promise to Abraham of blessing for all people? Well, what does it look like? What does that look like for good life for all people, where all people have access to just fundamental resources? So I'm very interested in not being a socialist or a communist, but I'm interested in, when did we see you hungry and do something about it? When did we see you homeless and do something about it? When did we see you without adequate clothing and do something about it? That's gospel talk. I got chapter and verse for that.
Now, what I think from this, and you've helped me really put this together, is that empire ultimately concerns itself with those in power, and empire concern themselves with those in power with an empire. And as a result of that, the poor and the oppressed remain poor and oppressed, and maybe even more poor and oppressed. Whereas Jesus's kingdom, gospel kingdom, comes in and says, no, we sacrifice self at the cross for the sake of the other. And that there's this concern for justice and the well-being, at least that everyone at least has food, that everyone has at least what they need to get along. My concern then, throwing this into the larger picture of Revelation, is that we have capitulated to empire because we didn't think of that was an empire. We thought it was good. We ignore the fact that 25% of the kids, whatever the number might be, go to bed hungry at night in our country. And McKnight was talking about this as well. So do you see that conflict being even more intense today? Because for John, empire was easy to spot, or easier to spot, whereas for us, empire's not as apparent.
Oh, don't think that empire in the first century as a destructive system. I don't think that was the pervasive way of thinking about it.
Okay.
And I think one of the reasons that Revelation works so hard to make this analysis is that it's not abundantly obvious to the folks in the churches.
Very good. I would agree. Yeah.
If you read through Revelation from beginning to end, it's relentless. In this critique. And I think one of the reasons for having the 7 letters to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3 is precisely so that everybody can read everybody else's mail, right? So that you get 7 chances to make the point. And likewise, chapters 4 through 22, this is a big book in New Testament terms. And it's relentless in its critique. It's relentless in exposing these problems. It's relentless in showing that this is a world that is so destructive for so many people. And you're right, Rob, empire works really well for the 2 or 3% who are in control, or in our society for the 1%ers. Empire works really well for them.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah.
But for some of the rest, middle class, we can do our accommodations and we can get by. But for folks dropping out the bottom, this is a terrible system.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that we ought to overthrow it and all become communists or socialists or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
But there is work to be done in transforming how this takes place, how this happens. And if every church congregation got to work in this country on matters of food or housing or health.
Yeah, healthcare. Yeah.
We could have a massive transformative approach.
Absolutely.
But I think, to take up an aspect of what you just said, Rob, I think we have been dazzled, we have been deceived by empire, because it's very individualistic, we're mesmerized by power. Yeah. We like being dominant in this country. I come from a little country at the bottom of the world. We couldn't dominate anybody if we tried. It wasn't even in the cultural mindset.
Maybe in rugby or cricket, you guys are pretty good.
Well, certainly not in cricket.
Not in cricket? Okay. Rugby.
Certainly not in cricket.
Okay.
But sometimes in rugby, and that's a bit of a national crisis at the moment anyway.
Sorry to bring that up to you, but
no, that's fine. I can watch
Vinnie and I will
from
be available
outside.
for counseling after we're done
Yes.
with this golf.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Especially Vinnie, because he knows what it's like to suffer with his
Yes,
sports
very
teams.
much.
There you go. There you
Yeah.
go.
We hope you're enjoying the podcast, and we want to remind you that everything we do at Determined Truth, the podcast, Rob's blog, and our YouTube channel, is available on the Determined Truth app. Directions on how to download the app is available in the show notes and on the determinedtruth.com website. Just click on the app tab.
Hey, I'm curious on something, though, Warren, because there's constantly conversations in the church about like how involved we should be in politics. And if you look at if you survey Christian history and maybe the spectrum of Christian involvement in government and social orders, you might have on one far end of the spectrum, maybe an Anabaptist tradition that's very separatist.
Right.
You could look at maybe the other end of the spectrum and maybe I'm thinking of like Presbyterian theonomists. You were to characterize that as like the spectrum where it's full separatism or full immersion, and there's everything else in between.
Right.
When you're even talking about the gospel changing things, are you advocating that this is happening through the local church, or how would you encourage Christians to be involved in the public square? I'm just curious your take on that, and to be faithful to the message that John is helping us heed in Revelation.
Yeah, no, I think that poses it really well, and I think it is a massive dilemma. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So there are certain enticements and temptations and trappings and whatever deceptions of power. Right. So I don't want to say it can only happen in one way. And God bless those who think that they can make a difference through, say, national politics or even state government. I think you've got to be very careful if you're going to do that about which mast you want to tie yourself to and how you're going to operate and for what agenda you're going to operate. And what are you going to swallow things hook, line, and sinker? Or are you going to be a critical presence in the midst? Whose agenda are you going to buy into? And Revelation, I think, raises all those questions. So I think that's possible. That's a real possibility. But I do think local communities can make a big difference.
Okay, very good.
And I do think local churches, if they understand themselves as missional communities, and we're not just here for ourselves, but the church actually exists for the world. Yeah. And in this case, for local issues. And I don't mean the trivial stuff, the nitty gritty of daily life for lots of folks in most communities. And I do think we've got resources there. We've got energy, we've got time, we've got skills that can make a difference if we can harness those sorts of things. So I don't want to rule any one sphere out. But I do think local communities in our society do have lots of opportunity and possibility.
And you ask a good series of questions in pages, I think, 121 and 122 at the end of your book, that John's asking whether we've settled for mammon rather than God. He asks us how we think about societal good. And you go through a long list there. And it's really good. And I don't want to diminish that part of the conversation, stopping there. If I can transition a little bit, and that is, do you see the succumbing of the Western church, the American church in particular? And I know you're probably an American citizen by now, I'm assuming, but the American church, that we've capitulated to the beast so that we justify war. We justify a siege on Gaza. I don't know where you stand on that. We justify violence in Ukraine and supporting war and backing the military industrial complex without recognizing the fact that we're actually endorsing beastly activities. What do you think about that?
Yeah, this is one of the things that really strikes me as a foreigner, as an outsider, about this society, of just how militarized it is. Okay. When I had kids who were in high school, and of course they were in marching band, and no matter how often they told us that the football game was just a prelude to the band at halftime.
That's where Vinnie lives.
Yes,
Very, very happy to believe that. But even at that level, the presence of folks from ROTC and the presentation of flag and all that sort of stuff, even at a football match, we've got this sort of militarization.
I think that was ROTC, right? Is that the?
Yep,
Yep. Yeah.
Never heard of it as ROTC before.
Yeah, that's how the kids used to refer to it. But yeah, ROTC. And so I don't know what to say about that. I know that in the early church, Tertullian, for example, wrote about how Christians should not be members of the army, but of the military. But his argument is primarily because it's a place in which idolatry is very hard to escape.
Okay.
It's much less about the activity of violence, which of course is what war is. And Revelation and violence is such a difficult topic because we have all these scenes of destruction of a quarter of the earth and a third of the earth and all this sort of stuff. And even if we remind ourselves that we're not reading actual reports, we're reading visions which have a particular meaning. Even if we remind ourselves of that, these visions are very violent. And even in chapter 17 and 18, where we have this, and I use the word neutrally, not pejoratively, but we have this fantasy of the destruction of Rome. It's very violent. It's very destructive. And as much as Revelation wants to advocate this way of love, one of the ways of advocating the way of love is to present it in violent scenarios. Even the writer of this document, who is so opposed to the violent ways of empire, employs violence in making the argument. And that's not a condemnatory statement. We're all way up here in these processes of empire, myself included. We're all deeply enmeshed in this system. So I'm not self-righteously sitting outside it and saying, not a problem for me. No way.
If we can finish this up with the final question, and I'll say final question, but I think we're all preachers here, and so that doesn't necessarily mean anything. If John were writing to the United States or New Zealand, Great Britain, whatever, what do you think his letter to us would say?
I imagine if John was writing it, it would be pretty comparable to what we have in Revelation. I think imperial systems just take different forms. They grow legs and they go different places to happen. We know that all imperialists have taken the one course, Imperialism 101, and the syllabus hasn't changed for thousands of years. So I imagine that's what his emphasis would be. Your world is out of shape. Your world is not aligned with divine purposes of life for all people. You need to recognize that. And then I think, now this is me, not John, because John would say retreat. I would say, okay, recognize that, and we have work to do to transform it. And there are plenty of people doing that good work already. I don't want to pretend that it hasn't even started. There are plenty of people doing good work in our society. And I think local churches as missional communities can really throw their weight and their resources into those sorts of efforts.
Excellent. Vinnie, anything else you have?
No, I think that's just been fascinating as I'm sitting just gleaning it and just thinking of critiques of not only empire, but even maybe a different perspective that Warren's bringing in, but with Warren even really just wanting to contextualize John and saying, okay, that might not go far enough for where we're at. I just think it's extremely helpful and hopefully challenging I know it's challenging for me, but challenging for people to think and not wanting to get defensive, because we oftentimes do that when we hear something that's different. And even some of the language that you're using, people might get defensive, like, who is Warren to tell John what he should or shouldn't have done? And I don't think that's what you're saying. I don't think that's your heart on this, but it's just, no, like, we need to push this harder and really dig in, especially with the opportunities that we have in our context and how we've been empowered and what we're enabled to do.
Yeah, that's what I said at the beginning about, I think, the great gift of Revelation is that it presses these questions. And you refer to that list, Rob, in the book of those the sorts of questions that Revelation provokes.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're easy questions. They're not simple questions. Now, I'm not persuaded by the answer. And I think most people in our society are not persuaded by the answer. We're all going to run away somewhere. Well, where are we all going to go? It's just not a practical emphasis.
I fear with that, and I think I understand where you're going with it, but I fear with that, and let me close in a minute with maybe reading that whole list again. But I fear with that maybe the danger is to not run away at all and to embrace empire and the prostitute and the beast and succumb to it. I think that's what we've done anyways. Right?
Yeah, I think that's where we are so often. And
Yeah.
I think that's the danger.
Yeah.
And I think finding a liminal existence, an in-between existence of recognizing a context, but recognizing that, in a sense, we're out of step with it because we have a fundamentally different commitment that we need to be working out. We need to be looking for ways to work out. So, yeah, and I think that's difficult. I think that's a difficult place to live. I don't pretend that it isn't for half a second, but that's one of the reasons that we're in communities. It's one of the reasons that
good point.
The church can be supportive of one another in these efforts that we can make a difference.
Excellent. Let me go ahead and read that list just for everyone's sake here. John asks whether we have settled for mammon rather than God. He wonders who or what we worship. He asks how we think about societal good, about matters of justice and the right of all people to adequate resources for life, and about how that thinking might shape our living. He asks us about our fascination with power, with might is right, with self-interest, and whether those values and structures are best for our life together on planet Earth. He wonders about the size of our hearts, whether we comprehend the passion of God for the well-being of all people, and whether that makes any difference to our living. He wonders if we have understood God to be working in the world for the benefit of all people, not just for a privileged few, and whether we have aligned our lives with God's purposes in personal, communal, and national matters. He asks about our ultimate loyalties, whether anyone or anything usurps God's central place in our lives, under what circumstances, and with what impact. That's pages 121 and 122. Anything you want to add to that, Warren?
No, it's a challenging list, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Excellent. It's well done. Appreciate so much again you coming on with us. We've enjoyed the conversation, and again, keep up the good work. And maybe we'll have you back on again. Vinnie and I are going to go back to 2 Corinthians and work our way through the rest of the New Testament now. So,
all right. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the work you do. And when you've got this all sorted out, if you just drop me an email, that would be really, I'd appreciate that.
Nice.
Very good. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, and we'll link in the show notes a couple of the resources. But like Rob, you had mentioned the "What Does Revelation Reveal" that Warren read on Revelation, and I just also think when we had Warren on last year, whenever I don't even remember when it was at this point, it was a while ago. Your book, "The Roman Empire and the New Testament: An Essential Guide," we talked to you a lot about that, and you had mentioned you even wrote that for church Bible studies and that sort of thing to go to. It really is written at a layperson's level.
Right.
And I even think that resource would be extremely helpful to go through Revelation, because that's the world that John is living in. So I think both those resources would be great for a study in Revelation.
Yeah, no, I agree. The Revelation book actually has study questions with each chapter, so that can help groups wrestle with some of this. But I think you're right. The Roman Empire in the New Testament lays out some of these larger structures and visions and practices. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Warren. Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Great having you on.
All right. Thanks much. Bye.
All right. So that was a cool conversation. What were some of your thoughts? Because Warren definitely, it's interesting. I feel like he's that prolific scholar that all the other people who we know about and who we read and who we've interviewed, they all know about him, but he's not going to be a household name in the way that a Scott McKnight or Michael Gorman or those other popular writers are. What were some of your thoughts in what some of the things that Dr. Carter was saying?
I was really intrigued by the fact that he had a strong conviction of the role of the church today in taking care of poverty and these issues and how we have the ability to do so. And yet it seemed like his understanding that John didn't seem to have a game plan. John was like, okay, Jezebel, you're a problem. This is not going to work. Come out of her, my people. And I was surprised that he took Revelation so strongly as like this binary. It's either black or white. You're either with me or you're against me. And that he didn't feel that John was nuancing it. And I'm a little skeptical of that. And I guess the way I would phrase it would be, I think it's hard for us to judge the work of someone else, in this case, John, the biblical writer of the book of Revelation, because we don't really know exactly what his plan was. And to say he had no plan, I'm not certain of that. And I'm not certain that we are in the best position to judge. And obviously, I'm going to be a little bit prejudiced to say I'm on the biblical writer's side a little bit more than critiquing it. So I think to say that Jezebel, whoever she was, or whoever this teacher was in Thyatira, was just radically wrong, I think maybe John knew something that we might not know, and I'd be a little bit more cautious about critiquing John and saying he went too far. What are some of your thoughts there?
It still struck me, and I'm still processing through, because he had made the comment I don't think John went far enough. It was some kind of comment like that. And I've been sitting on that. And at first glance, it's hard. Like, how do you critique a biblical writer?
Yeah.
But then I've been thinking how I've actually thought, and I think many of us think similar things. Maybe we ask it in a different way. But how often, especially in Protestant churches, we love Paul. Sermon series are always through the letters of Paul. And how many times have we asked the question, I wish Paul would have addressed this, or why did he keep talking about this in this kind of way? And so while the way Warren phrased that statement might have been a little jarring to me in terms of how would you critique that way? I'm thinking we do the same thing. We just say it in a different kind of way oftentimes, whereas I wish Paul would have done this. So why wouldn't we say the same thing about John and Revelation? But it makes sense because Revelation is such a deep, difficult book. It's so different than a letter, where we love letters because they're contemporary for us. Apocalypses are not contemporary. And so it makes sense that we would just have a difficult enough time struggling through the letter itself to figure out what's being said, let alone say, oh, I know what he's saying and I wish he would have said this as well. So I think that's where I'm landing on that, just giving grace and charity in terms, not that he said anything wrong. It's just, I've never thought about that way. So you're just trying to interpret him in the best possible light.
Yeah. Excellent.
I also think though, with him, for Warren, you're always going to hear the concept of empire coming up. Right? Yes. And it reminds me how we have great contributions from scholars all over the place. And oftentimes scholars, I found, they have their thing that they hone in on. Yeah. And so you read N.T. Wright and you're always going to hear about exile and exile themes. That's going to, sometimes does he maybe overread exile? Who knows? But that's really something he's pinged in on. And so he's going to see that in a lot of the biblical text. Warren's going to emphasize empire on a lot of things. I might not normally do it. And every scholar has their thing, but I think it's good for us to also hear those voices because it helps us maybe kick us out of the place where we might normally go to, especially in evangelical world where everything is just, no, the Bible is me and Jesus. And so here to hear those perspectives as well. I just, those are always just helpful for me to kick me out of my comfort zone in reading.
Yeah, but that's actually where I was a little surprised that he didn't go there because empire is his thing that he does such an excellent job of, that he didn't go there to contemporize it and say, empire is the United States, it's Russia, it's China. I was expecting the conversation to go there when John didn't really tell us a program. I'm like, John gives a wonderful program. That's the problem's empire. And look, all you have to do is see empire all around. So I was just surprised that he didn't go in that direction there. But nonetheless, it was a good conversation.
The wrap up with him, his book on the Roman Empire, that booklet he did, honestly, that is a great read, especially as an introductory level, especially if you're familiar with the Bible and the New Testament, but it's only been from a Sunday school kind of way, which is oftentimes just a sermon that's having a moral ethic at the end. That's just a really good, accessible eye-openers. That book's been extremely helpful for me.
Great.
Yeah. Cool. Sorry. I guess we'll wrap this up then. And I hope everyone's enjoying this. We'll be on next week and we just continue on with interviews. And these are exciting. These are the best when we get to have folks on to get their perspective. So come back next week. And I don't even know who we have in the queue. I guess we'll make it a surprise. All right, man. I will catch you next time and see everyone later.
No, Vinnie, you won't see anybody.
I want to thank you for joining us on today's podcast, and we would love for you to share the work of Determined Truth with others. Please follow this podcast and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your review will go a long way towards helping others find this podcast. Then share it with others so that we can get the word of the gospel of the kingdom to more people.